Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something wild. We are going to completely, and I mean absolutely, shatter the Hollywood glamour surrounding America's most infamous outlaw duo, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. You know, when most of us picture Bonnie and Clyde, we immediately see Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty from that iconic 1967 film, right? We picture this glamorous, rebellious couple speeding down dusty roads, outsmarting the cops, and sticking it to the greedy banks during the Great Depression. But the truth? Well, the truth is far darker, a lot more desperate, and incredibly violent. So today, we're putting the folklore aside. We're looking directly at the gritty, historical reality of their lives and their brutally gruesome end. Okay, let's dive into this. 167. That staggering number, that represents the estimated amount of bullets and buckshot pumped into Bonnie and Clyde's car during their final, fatal ambush on a quiet Louisiana highway. Just take a second and think about that volume of lead. That wasn't just a shootout, it was an absolute annihilation by a posse of 6 lawmen. Hearing a number like that instantly cuts right through the romance, doesn't it? It brings us face to face with the extreme, overwhelming violence that defined both their crime spree and, ultimately, their demise. But to understand how they ended up in the crosshairs of such a massive barrage, we've got to look at the world that actually created them. See, the public at the time viewed them through a very specific, almost hopeful lens. During the Great Depression, people were starving, they were losing their jobs, and banks were foreclosing on family farms left and right. So when Bonnie and Clyde were reported to be robbing banks, a desperate public kind of saw them as these modern-day Robin Hoods striking back at the man. But the gritty reality? Actually, scratch the whole mastermind bank robber idea. In reality, they mostly knocked over small-time mom-and-pop grocery stores and rural gas stations, often literally just for a handful of spare change. They definitely weren't heroes of the working class. They were victimizing the very same struggling people who were reading about them in the daily papers. So you're probably wondering, how did the myth get so out of control? Well, it was largely a massive accident. It was birthed by this famous 1932 snapshot of Bonnie chomping on a cigar, pistol in hand. The Barrow gang accidentally left a roll of undeveloped film behind in a Joplin, Missouri hideout after fleeing this really bloody shootout. The cops found the film, developed it, and boom, the photos were splashed across newspapers nationwide. Suddenly, these small-time criminals looked like a glamorous, daring, untouchable syndicate. And the public? They absolutely ate it up. Yet, ironically, while all of America stared in awe at these photos, Bonnie and Clyde were practically starving. They were living in squalor and sleeping in cold, stolen cars. To really grasp their story, we have to understand their roots. Clyde and his brother Buck grew up in a poverty so deep, it's almost unfathomable to us today. I mean, they lacked basic education and lived in a West Dallas slum. Long before they ever pointed a gun at a bank teller, they were stealing chickens, well, chickens and turkeys, actually, just to put food in their stomachs. It was survival, first and foremost. This extreme, crushing, Depression-era desperation, that is the soil from which the Barrow gang grew. They were products of a profoundly broken economic system, basically taking whatever they felt they needed just to stay alive. Now, Bonnie Parker was a bit different from Clyde. She was actually an aspiring poet, top of her class in spelling, and highly intelligent. But she was also deeply fatalistic. While sitting in a Texas jail cell, she penned a poem titled The Story of Suicide Sal. Suicide Sal was basically Bonnie's outlaw alter ego. And in this poem, Sal is a gangster's girl who fully, completely expects her life to end looking down the barrel of a submachine gun. Bonnie wasn't under any illusions about her future, guys. She worshipped Clyde, and she knowingly tied her fate to a man she knew would eventually be gunned down in the street. She was literally writing her own tragic ending long before it even happened. So let's go ahead and strip away that criminal mastermind label once and for all. The daily reality of the Barrow gang was anything but glamorous. They survived on clumsy, panicked blunders, not these elaborate Ocean's 11-style heists. They spent their days perpetually exhausted and terrified. They bathed in freezing cold streams, ate cold beans out of tin cans, and lived in constant, suffocating fear of the law. And it was a bloody trail, too. They killed at least 9 law enforcement officers and several civilians during their frantic escapes. This wasn't some calculated criminal empire. It was a chaotic, bloody road trip fueled purely by adrenaline, fear, and a total lack of any long-term plan. And this brilliantly illustrates Clyde's absolute obsession with his ultimate tool of the trade, the Ford V8. Get this, Clyde Barrow actually wrote a letter to Henry Ford himself praising the vehicle. Because they literally lived out of their cars, speed and reliability weren't just luxuries, they were a matter of life and death. The newly introduced 1934 Ford V8 deluxe sedan was an absolute powerhouse. It allowed them to outrun local police cruisers with ease, so they stole them constantly. The specific Ford V8 they were driving at the very end, a dark gray sedan they'd stolen from Topeka, Kansas, was effectively their home, their weapon, and, as we're about to see, their tomb. Because, of course, the law eventually caught up. Let's walk through exactly how it went down. On the morning of May 23, 1934, just outside Gibbsland, Louisiana, the trap was sprung. Former Texas Ranger Frank Kamer and his posse had been tracking them for months. They orchestrated a ruthless ambush, using the father of a gang member, a man named Ivy Methvin. Before 9:15 a.m., Ivy parked his truck on the side of a rural road pretending he had a flat tire. Right at 9:15, Bonnie and Clyde approached in their Ford V8 and actually slowed down to help him. Just moments later, a logging truck suddenly appeared on the road, causing a split second of confusion among the lawmen. Fearing the duo was reaching for their heavy weaponry, the posse didn't even hesitate. They opened fire, unleashing that torrent of 167 bullets we discussed earlier, giving Bonnie and Clyde absolutely zero chance to surrender. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it totally shatters the sanitized movie screen version of death. This right here is a direct quote from the first-hand, handwritten account of an undertaker at the McKamy-Campbell Funeral Home down in Dallas, who actually worked on Bonnie Parker's body. The visual reality was completely grotesque. Her right hand, her trigger hand, was nearly severed. The right side of her face was just gone. Her body was horribly mangled, full of buckshot and bullets. Reading this historical document forces us to confront the true, visceral, physical cost of their violent lifestyle. This wasn't a peaceful fade-to-black cinematic ending. It was a literal butchery. And the aftermath at the funeral home? It was an absolute macabre nightmare. The undertakers noted that the bodies arrived as just a mass of caked and dried blood. Because the corpses had leaked embalming fluid during transport, the smell in that sweltering Texas heat was so completely overwhelming that it actually caused Bonnie's mother to faint. It took the undertakers 2 full hours just to pick the dirt, the rocks, and the shattered windshield glass out of Bonnie's hair before they could even wash it. Finally, after hours and hours of agonizing reconstructive work just to hide the massive trauma, Bonnie Parker was dressed and laid to rest in an ice blue negligee. But here is the truly wild part. The sheer brutality of their deaths did absolutely nothing to stop the public's obsession. Just look at this number, 40,000. To put that into perspective, that's enough people to fill a modern baseball stadium. That is the estimated number of spectators who flooded the streets around the Dallas funeral home, all just to catch a morbid glimpse of Bonnie Parker's corpse. The crowds were so massive and honestly so chaotic that 38 police officers had to be stationed in shifts just to keep order. One neighbor even had to turn a garden hose on the rabid crowd just to keep them from trampling her property. It was a grotesque circus. People were treating the bloody aftermath of a multi-state killing spree like it was some glamorous Hollywood movie premiere. Which brings us to the final big question I want to leave you with today. Why do we continue to romanticize such brutal and tragic history? We've walked through the desperate poverty, the clumsy, small-time robberies, the terrifying ambush, and the mutilated bodies. Yet almost a century later, the names Bonnie and Clyde still evoke this sense of rebellious romance, rather than the grim, bloody reality of 2 young lives thrown away in the dirt. It really challenges us to look at how we consume history, doesn't it? And how easily we let folklore and myth completely obscure the gritty truth. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the legends, and I'll catch you next time.